The advances from the Constitution ended in Alabama and elsewhere with the brutal attacks on Reconstruction and the rewrite of Alabama's state constitution in 1875.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Adam, let's wrap up with some November labor history.
Let's do it, and we'll call it a day. I know it's Iron Bowl Saturday. For some of you listening, that means absolutely nothing. For some of you, it's a big deal.
That means everything.
Right. Yeah. For some of you, it probably means too much. Maybe if you're not our listener, but I'm sure if you're tuning in from the state of Alabama, you know it's a big deal today. And we just came off the Thanksgiving holiday. Again, I hope everyone had a good one. Shout out to all the airline employees this week. I know you're dealing with a lot of extra, so that's why I'm wearing my Delta AFA button today. So as we close out the month of November, I wanted to take a few minutes to share some of the November anniversaries in labor history, as well as important days of recognition for social justice. I compiled this information primarily from the 2022-23 edition of Planning to Change the World, a plan book for social justice educators. So, should have mentioned that in the chat with Hayden Wright. The Planning to Change the World Planner, excellent resource if you're interested in having conversations with young people about social justice. So this excellent planner is published by the Education for Liberation Network, and I also wanted to give a shout out to Zen Education Project, which does some really cool This Day in History, hashtag TDIH, This Day in History posts. So, let's get started. November is National American Indian Heritage Month, which recognizes the significant contributions of Native Americans. So it's fitting that we next mention November 2nd as the 50th anniversary of Native American protesters' occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters. The Trail of Broken Treaties protests aimed at redressing grievances of the Native American population for centuries of ill treatment by the U.S. government. When they arrived in D.C. and found no government official willing to discuss their 20-point manifesto, the protesters took over the BIA building, occupying it for a week. Government infiltrators incited violence, which resulted in significant damage to the building as well as to the public perception of the Native Americans' cause. Always got to watch out for saboteurs. November 3rd was the 50th anniversary of New York protests of the Rehabilitation Act's veto. Activists for disabled citizens blocked traffic in Manhattan to protest President Richard Nixon's veto of the Rehabilitation Act, which would have provided a wide range of assistance for people with disabilities. One group of protesters gathered outside the Roosevelt Hotel, where the Committee to Re-elect Nixon was located. They entered the building, staging a sit-in, demanding that Nixon debate them on the issue. Now, obviously, that didn't happen, but others protested outside the federal building, and it is remembered as a major day of action for people with disabilities. On November 5th, in 1867, delegates gathered in Montgomery, Alabama, to draft a new state constitution, as required by the Reconstruction Acts. Prior to the Reconstruction era, no Southern state had a state-financed public education system, even for whites. Alabama's new constitution established a centralized board of education and mandated that schools receive 20% of state revenue. By 1871, nearly 55,000 African American and 87,000 white children were attending public schools. The advances from the Constitution ended in Alabama and elsewhere with the brutal attacks on Reconstruction and the rewrite of Alabama's state constitution in 1875, and then again in 1901. But a lot of folks do not know how Reconstruction truly changed the game when it comes to public education. November 6th was the 10th anniversary of the legalization of same-sex marriage in multiple states. On November 6, 2012, voters in Maine, Maryland, and the District of Columbia passed referenda enabling same-sex couples to legally marry. In Minnesota, voters rejected a constitutional amendment barring same-sex marriage. These ballot measures marked the first time that same-sex marriage was approved by the popular vote rather than by legislative or court action. It was a clear sign that the tide had turned in voter sentiment on the issue. and it's sad to think that in 2022, there are elites with power who want to move backwards on this and so many other issues of civil rights. A lot was happening November 8th in history and today. November 8th was Election Day. All 435 seats in the House of Representatives, 35 Senate seats, 36 state and 3 territorial governorships, and numerous state and local government offices were all on the ballot, as were several ballot measures in states like Illinois that codified union rights, and in Tennessee that unfortunately enshrined a right to work in their state constitution. November 8th was also the 70th anniversary of the Mayabuye Uprising. As part of the defiance campaign led by the African National Congress, the uprising took place at a beer hall in Kimberley to protest South African apartheid. 13 protesters were killed and 78 others were seriously wounded when government security forces opened fire on the protesters. The defiance campaign was a series of acts of civil disobedience to protest the apartheid regime, similar to the acts of defiance of Black Americans protesting Jim Crow. Also on November 8th, but 130 years ago, 30,000 factory and dock workers staged the 1892 New Orleans General Strike, demanding union recognition, closed shops, wage increases, and more. They were joined by non-industrial laborers such as musicians, clothing workers, clerks, utility workers, streetcar drivers, and printers. Most importantly, African American and white workers united despite active attempts to divide the workers on racial lines. November 9th was the birthday of abolitionist Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, who lived from 1802 to 1837. Lovejoy, a white Presbyterian minister, was the editor of the St. Louis Observer, which was an abolitionist anti-Jacksonian paper. After his printing press had been destroyed for a third time because of his critical opinions on slavery, Lovejoy moved to Alton, Illinois, where he started another abolitionist paper called the Alton Observer. In November 1837, a mob attacked the paper's warehouse and Lovejoy was murdered. November 10th, in 1898, white supremacists murdered African Americans in Wilmington, North Carolina, and deposed the elected Reconstruction-era government in a coup d'etat. After the riot, thousands of black citizens fled. In 1900, the North Carolina legislature effectively stripped African Americans of the vote through the Grandfather Clause and ushered in the worst of the Jim Crow laws in North Carolina. November 11th was Veterans Day, originally intended to mark the end of World War I on the 11th day of the 11th month, but which now celebrates all those who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces. November 11th was also the 30th anniversary of the publishing of Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazards. This volume of 16 articles, written primarily by scholars of color, exposes the facts of environmental inequity and its consequences. It is only the second book of its kind, following Dr. Robert Bullard's 1990 Dumping in Dixie, which expanded on his 1983 paper, Solid Waste and the Black Houston Community. And when I was in Houston a couple of weeks ago, I was lucky enough to hear Dr. Bullard speak. He's considered kind of the intellectual grandfather of the environmental justice movement, and really, really appreciate the work he has done to tie in the ways race and pollution and environmental destruction are all tied together. Race, class, pollution, the environment, there are a lot of connections there, and he's been doing just amazing work over the past several decades documenting it. On November 13th, 1953, during the height of the McCarthy era, Robin Hood and his band of merry outlaws made headlines. Mrs. White of the Indiana Textbook Commission called for a ban of Robin Hood in all school books for promoting communism because he stole from the rich to give to the poor. In response to White's attempts at censorship, as well as the larger McCarthy witch hunt it was part of, 5 students from Indiana University at Bloomington started the Green Feather movement. They had been meeting in a religious fellowship at a Baptist church and were moved by their faith to take action. So, lest you think the ridiculous book banning cultural wars of today are something new, they're not. We're still living in the Red Scare, folks. November 15th was the 100th anniversary of the workers' massacre in Guayaquil, Ecuador. After a 3-day general strike, which left the town without water, electricity, and adequate food, Ecuador's president and the unions came to an agreement to end the strike and accede to the workers' demands. Security forces, however, didn't get the news and opened fire on the unarmed protesters, killing at least 300. The next day, the settlement was signed, but the damage was done, and relations among labor, management, and the government were irrevocably broken. On November 16, 1989, 6 Jesuit scholars and priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter were murdered by the U.S.-backed, trained, and equipped military in El Salvador. The priests were internationally recognized scholars who wrote and spoke extensively about the need for peace and the root causes of the war in El Salvador. They were among the 75,000 people killed during this period. November 17th is International Students' Day, an international observance and celebration of student community, multiculturalism, and inclusivity. It was originally intended to commemorate the storming of Czech universities by Nazi Germany, and colleges and universities now mark it as a celebration of their international students. November 19th in 1915, the state of Utah executed Joe Hill, labor organizer, songwriter, and member of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. Joe Hill became famous around the world after a Utah court convicted him of murder. Even before the international campaign to have his conviction reversed, Joe Hill was well known on picket lines and at workers' rallies as the author of popular labor songs and as an IWW agitator. November 20th is the Transgender Day of Remembrance. This day is set aside to memorialize those who were killed because of anti-transgender hatred. In November 1919, in Bogalusa, Louisiana, agents of the Great Southern Lumber Company formed a gang to threaten African-American labor organizer Saul Dacus. He was trying to form a union for black laborers at the sawmill under very dangerous conditions. On November 21st, company gunmen and members of the Self-Preservation and Loyalty League, the SPLL, showed up at Dacus's home. He and his family survived the shootout that evening. The next day, on November 22nd in 1919, Dacus bravely walked through town, accompanied by white supporters and allies in the labor movement. Determined to undermine any efforts at interracial solidarity, the Great Southern Lumber Company gang murdered 4 of those white allies, including the American Federation of Labor District Representative. Dacus and his family were able to escape to New Orleans. The Bogalusa Massacre is an example of the violence interracial labor organizing experienced from racist anti-labor forces in the early 20th century. Yet another example is on November 23, 1887, when the Louisiana militia, aided by bands of prominent white citizens, shot and killed 30 to 60 unarmed striking black sugar workers in what became known as the Thibodeau Massacre. Black Louisiana sugarcane workers, in cooperation with the racially integrated Knights of Labor, had gone on strike at the beginning of November 1887 over their meager pay issued in company scrip, not cash. The scrip was redeemable only at the company store, where excessive prices were charged, and they routinely ripped off the workers. This was part of the violent end to the Reconstruction era of the United States. It was also a devastating attack on organized labor in the South. November 24th is Thanksgiving, also known as a day of mourning among some indigenous communities. And November 24th was also the 10th anniversary of the Tazreen fashion factory fire in Bangladesh. The fire caused at least 117 deaths and injuries to more than 200 workers, making it the deadliest factory fire in Bangladesh history. More than 4 million Bangladeshi, most of them young women, work in garment factories for less than $40 a month under extremely unsafe conditions. When fire broke out, managers ordered workers to keep working. The exit doors were locked, and the windows on the lower floors had security bars, trapping workers inside. I want to send our remembrance to all these workers and so many others around the world. International solidarity is a must. November 25th, Yesterday, Black Friday, is known in some circles as Buy Nothing Day, an international day of protest against consumerism, strategically celebrated on Black Friday, the busiest shopping day of the year in the U.S., which also makes it a day that features a lot of strikes for that very reason. I want to take this moment to give a shout out to all of the folks in retail and service industries. Whether you're at a restaurant, a mall, a big box store, or a small shop, shout out to all of you working through the holiday madness. You are on the front lines of America's consumerist spectacle, and of course virus transmission, we should not forget. You deal with some of the worst aspects of our fellow humanity, and you work while others spend time with friends and family. You deserve a raise, you deserve a union, you deserve a contract that guarantees due process and health care and retirement and more. Thanks for all you do, those of you working in these sectors, and please continue to organize. November 26th is the birthday of abolitionist and women's rights advocate Sarah Grimke. Sarah Grimke and her sister Angelina rebelled against their father, a North Carolina slaveholder. They were staunch abolitionists and women's rights advocates, speaking out publicly at a time when most women often didn't. The Grimke sisters were the first women to speak before a state legislature as representatives of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Their ideas were controversial to many in their community, to say the least. Angry mobs burned their speeches, and their writings were burned in protest. But I think it's worth remembering the Grimkes and so many others who stood strong in the abolitionist movement at a time of great pressure against them. And while we can reflect on the many tragedies of American history, it's also worth remembering the many, many good people who fought against them. And on that note, November 26th is the 110th anniversary of the release of the Lawrence textile strikers. Joseph James Eder, Arturo Giovannetti, and Joseph Caruso were arrested for the murder of a bystander at the 1912 Lawrence textile strike. They were released after international groups protested and went on strike in solidarity. Despite evidence that the men were not present during the killing of Ana Lopezzo, they were accused of murder and kept in metal cages throughout their trial. It is still unknown whether Lopezzo was killed by strikers or police. November 29th is the 10th anniversary of the United Nations approval of Palestine as an observer state. The UN upgraded Palestine's status in the international body from observer to observer state, and the adoption of the resolution was timed to coincide with the observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. The member states that voted for the change did so to express, quote, the urgent need for the resumption and acceleration of peace negotiations. Among the 9 countries voting against the resolution, unsurprisingly, were Canada, the United States, and Israel. And finally, it was 105 years ago this month when the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in Russia. The Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin stormed the palace and toppled the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky, which itself had only been established earlier in 1917 after the hated Tsar was toppled in the February Revolution. Of course, due to the differences in calendars, the February and October revolutions in 1917 Russia took place in March and November on our calendars. So whatever one wants to think about the Russian Revolution, the many revolutions, and the brutal civil war that followed, there's no doubt these events shaped the course of the 20th century and beyond. So that's all I have for November's important holidays, anniversaries, and days of recognition, days of working class history.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.